Greetings, A Pushers. It's me, Mr. Lauer. And today I promise to not say as much as I did in my last lecture. With that being said, let's begin. Today's lecture is entitled Mercantilism and the Empire, which will include the economies of the English American colonies. Let's start with a review of mercantilism and what that is. If you remember, mercantilism was seen as the basis of a country's economic and political strengths. According to mercantilism, what countries would try to do is regulate trade and production to make sure they become more self-sufficient, more powerful, and colonies would actually provide raw materials to their parent country for industry to serve as a market for those manufactured goods. And basically, what I'm trying to say is colonies existed for one purpose only, and that is to enrich the parent country. So, in order to try to make sure the English colonies supported only England, one of the acts that was passed by England were the Navigation Acts in 1650. And what the Navigation Act said were that trade to and from the colonies could only be carried by English or colonial-built ships, and they could only be operated by English or colonial crews. So this means all of the goods imported into the colonies had to pass through ports in England. Specific goods that were made in the colonies, we talked about how big tobacco was, cotton, indigo, sugar, rice. Those could be imported only to England from the colonies. So why was England going to do this? Well, you can see here in this political cartoon, the colonies were basically the servants for the mother country. So anything that they produced would be shipped to England and only England, so they only had one market. And anything that England was producing that the colonies needed could only be bought from England. So, what kind of impact does that have on the colonies? Well, there were some positives. It does cause New England shipbuilding to become pretty big. It provides Chesapeake tobacco with a monopoly in England, and tobacco was pretty big in England at the time. And it also provided military forces from England to come over and protect the colonies from attacks from the French and the Spanish. Why? Because they wanted to protect their property. However, there were some negatives, and these laws limited the development of manufacturing in the colonies. It also forced these Chesapeake farmers to accept lower prices for their crops than they normally would have if they would have had a world market. And it also caused colonists to pay higher prices for the goods that they needed from England, those manufactured goods that they were getting from England. Now, historians look back and they say these laws were probably unnecessary because England would have naturally been the primary trading partner of their colonies. But what ends up happening is these laws begin ill will between England and the colonists over time, as you'll see. And, well, that's no good. So let's talk about the enforcement here. In the beginning, the British government was known for being pretty lax in their enforcement. The British agents that were in charge could be easily bribed. They were known for their corruption, and the colonists just found ways to get around these rules. Now that is until James II succeeds to the throne in 1685, and he's like, hey, I need to increase royal control over these colonists. They are getting away with too much, and I want to rule with an iron fist, blah, blah, blah. So he actually dissolves a lot of the colonial assemblies. He combines all of the New England colonies, as well as New York and New Jersey, into one single entity called the Dominion of New England in 1686. And so you can see here, all of this becomes the Dominion of New England instead of separate colonies. He also appoints a man as governor by the name of Sir Edmund Andros. And Andros comes in and he immediately starts taking over. He's levying taxes. He's limiting town meetings. he's getting rid of land titles, and he's reinstating the Church of England. So all of the autonomy that these colonies had was now gone. Thankfully, with the Glorious Revolution that hopefully you remember in 1688 from world history, William and Mary ascend to the throne, and the Dominion of New England comes to an end. Yay! However, the Dominion of New England changed the course of the New England colonies forever, because now the Puritan authority is really diminished and almost permanently. And also restrictions on colonial trade are starting to continue with even more oversight from England. So you're going to have more agents than ever stationed in the colonies, checking out what you're doing, making sure that everything's on the up and up. Now, this leads to the transatlantic trade, also known as the triangular trade, which is actually more complex than just the term triangular trade might indicate. But this is trade between Europe and the Americas and Africa of many goods and, yes, slaves. And we will get to that a little bit later here in the lecture. But because of all of these regulations, colonists got better at smuggling. So smuggling was actually pretty easy, especially for the natives of the colonists, or those who were living in the colonists, not the Native Americans, but those who were living in the colonists, because there were many inlets, coves, and islands here along the Atlantic seaboard, you see, and these provided perfect locations for colonial smugglers of all varieties. And this became a pretty widely accepted process, and some of the largest fortunes in the colonies actually grow from smuggling. What's interesting is John Hancock, yes, that John Hancock, the first signer of the Declaration, he inherited his Uncle Thomas's fortune, and at the age of 27, he becomes the wealthiest man in the colonies through his uncle's shipping business, and this is primarily from the profits of smuggling. And so there was really no effective way for the English to stop colonial smuggling altogether, although there were still local customs officials that could be bribed. And so what happens later on down the line in the 1760s, acts are passed to counter colonial smuggling. And now these acts, along with those navigation acts, are starting to be viewed as an attack on the rights and the freedoms of the colonists. Okay, here is a visual of that transatlantic or triangular trade. Okay, the colonial economy. So by the 1760s, almost half of Britain's world trade was with its own American colonies. So in addition to the long-standing navigation acts, the British government also started to limit colonial manufacturing, particularly of those items that competed with English industries, such as the production of textiles. So because of these mercantilistic policies, and also the richness of American land, the colonies were almost entirely engaged in agriculture. So let's look at the different sections of colonies and talk about their own unique, independent economies. So let's start with the New England colonies. So in New England, you got rocky soils, you got long winters, and so that's not going to be great for big-time farming. So a lot of the farming in New England was limited to subsistence levels. And you remember we talked about how New England was inhabited by families, and so these families would farm under 100 acres. They would do their own work. Sometimes they would hire labor, but a lot of these farms were very small. Also, the descendants of Puritans who are now inhabiting New England also profited from logging, from shipbuilding, fishing, trading, and rum distilling. The middle colonies had very rich soil. They produced an abundance of wheat for export to Europe and the West Indies, and they would have farms of up to 200 acres. They would hire some workers. There was still some indentured servants that would work alongside the farm family. There was a variety of small manufacturing efforts. Remember, there was very limited manufacturing because of the acts passed by the British. But there was some iron making, and trading actually led to the growth of some of the bigger cities, such as Philadelphia and New York. The southern colonies, most people in the southern colonies lived on subsistence farms with no slaves. Most people did. However, a few people lived on huge plantations, over 2,000 acres, and they relied almost entirely on slave labor. These plantations themselves were very self-sufficient. They could grow their own food. They had their own slave craft workers. The products that they made were mainly tobacco in the Chesapeake and North Carolina, timber and naval stores in the Carolinas, and naval stores would be like tar and pitch, rice and indigo in South Carolina and Georgia. And most of these plantations were located on water. They were located on rivers, so you could ship exports directly to Europe. Now, this actually meant that there were fewer big cities in the South than there were in the North because of that. And I mentioned transportation on water, and this was the easiest way to transport goods. So most trading centers, such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, were located on sites with good harbors, good bridges. If you had to use overland travel by horse and carriage, this actually increased a little bit, but not significantly until the mid-1700s. And so as people start to travel overland, we start to see taverns pop up. And these taverns would provide food, they would provide lodging, but they would also become social centers where news would be exchanged, politics would be discussed, and of course, whiskey would be drunk. I also noticed that I skipped monetary system, so let's talk about monetary system. Let's go back. So, the colonies were forced to use hard currency, gold and silver, to pay for the imports from Britain. And their imports were increasingly exceeding their exports. So some colonies actually attempt to supplement the money supply by printing paper currency, which you see here. This often led to inflation, and also Britain wanted no part of it. They wanted to protect their own merchants, and so the British government would often veto or refuse to accept colonial paper money. Hey, your money's no good here. Okay, so there we go. Sorry, I got a little backtrack there. Now we're back on track, and we will now talk about the horrid institution of slavery. So, in the midst of promoting mercantilistic goals, such as ensuring their supply of tobacco, they had to have their tobacco and sugar, slavery grew. By 1750, half of Virginia's population and 2/3 of South Carolina's population were enslaved. There was an increased demand for slaves, and there were three reasons really for this increase in demand. One, there was a reduce in migration from people from England. England's economy is back on track, so wages are increasing, so less people were leaving England to find better jobs and more money, and so we see less migrants, less indentured servants come over to the colonies. Also, plantation owners realized that slaves were a pretty dependable workforce. So they were disturbed by some of the political demands of small farmers and indentured servants. Also, some of the uprisings, Bacon's Rebellion was a big one. They were like, you know what, we need a population that we can totally control, that aren't going to rise up, they aren't going to give us any grief, and that was in the form of slaves. Also, they needed cheap labor because tobacco prices start to fall. Rice and indigo are going to become the most profitable crops. And so, hey, free labor is going to increase your profits. And unfortunately, slaves was the way they went. So as the number of slaves increase, these white colonists are adopting laws to make sure these African Americans would be held in bondage for life. And even in many cases, this slave status would be inherited. Massachusetts becomes the first colony in 1641 to recognize slavery. Virginia, in 1661, enacts legislation that states children automatically inherit their mother's enslaved status for life. By 1664, Maryland declared that baptism did not affect the enslaved person's status and that white women could not marry African American men. It becomes customary for whites to regard all blacks as social inferiors, and racism and slavery soon become tied together. They become integral to colonial society. And that kind of goes back to what we talked about that first week of school when we talked about race and how it was these laws and how rulers and the elite in society, the rules that were made, the laws that were made, led to this new way that people looked at slaves and African Americans, and that is where racism really grew. So back to the transatlantic slave trade. We talked about triangular trade very briefly, but part of this trade was the trading of African slaves, and this was a fundamental component of trading patterns between Europe and the Americas. In the 17th century, England's Royal African Company monopolizes the slave trade. But by the 18th century, many New England merchants want to enter this because they see the money that's being made. And so this slave trade follows a three-part route. Rum that was distilled in New England would be shipped to West Africa to be traded for slaves. They would then ride on the horrendous Middle Passage, maybe 75-85% would even make it alive, and they would move slaves from West Africa to the West Indies for a cargo of sugarcane, and the ship would finally return to New England where the sugar would be sold and used to make rum, and the process would just start all over again. And at each of these steps, the slave trading entrepreneur usually succeeded in making a pretty big load of money. So by the mid-1700s, the largest group of non-English immigrants were Africans, or the descendants of Africans, who were sold as enslaved laborers to the southern plantation owners and other colonists. The small number of non-slave African Americans still had to contend with laws in every colony that discriminated against them and limited their rights. By 1775, the African American population, both enslaved and free, made up 20% of the colonial population. And 90% of African Americans lived in southern colonies in lifelong bondage. Now, resistance from slaves was common. A lot of times that was subtle resistance, such as slowing down while working and things like that. But sometimes resistance was violent. And in 1739 in South Carolina, the largest slave uprising in the British colonies takes place, which is known as the Stono Rebellion. Around 45 whites were killed and 45 slaves were killed. Most of the slaves that took part were executed for their actions or sold back to the West Indies. But it was after this rebellion that the southern colonies tightened their control over slaves. They would make sure slaves did not assemble in groups. In fact, they made it illegal for slaves to assemble in groups, and more efforts were made to convert slaves to Christianity. And I hate to end our lecture on such a somber note. Here is a graphic showing the volume and direction of the transatlantic slave trade from all African to all American regions. And we will see you in class.